studying, working on for years. What, like maybe 5 years ago when we met, 4 or 5 years ago when we met, I knew you were thinking about sense making and rebuilding civilizations, and I'm curious. I've had the pleasure of just kind of being around you for years. What's the best way to tell probably a new audience about your work? I feel like, I'm wondering your favorite way to explain that.
I don't know that I have a favorite way to explain it, but
I'll jump in if I'll give my perspective, but I'd love to hear if you have a shot.
Kind of just a brief narrative from the beginning is I was homeschooled growing up, so I got to kind of make my own curriculum, which was fortunate. And a lot of it had to do with activism. My mom was big into activism, so I got into environmental work and animal rights work and social justice issues young. And my dad was into lots of areas of science and engineering and philosophy, so I was getting to have that braid of topics. And as I was exploring activism, one of the things that I found was how profoundly interconnected the problems were and how the solutions weren't adequately addressing them. And this started showing up all over the place. I got it in terms of looking at why are the ecological issues advancing and not getting better despite the huge amount of effort happening in the nonprofit space and government and for-benefit space. What is fundamentally inadequate about the nature of the solution? I remember being 13, working on helping some project that was in Kenya, protecting elephants from poaching in an area that was already protected, that the poachers could get in. And so I was 13, so I was just in the US, like going door to door, raising money and writing letters. And but the people who were there on the ground were having their life threatened by the poaching groups. And the solution was bigger fences around the preserve so poachers couldn't get in, and legislation in the country for harsher sentencing for poachers. And the solution, after a couple of years of like blood, sweat, and tears, finally worked. But it didn't address the poverty of the people that were poaching and the fact that, they were in parts of the world where, 25,000 kids are starving to death a day. It didn't address black markets on animal products. It didn't address mindsets towards animals. It didn't address a macroeconomy that creates poverty at scale and, ships it to the third world. It didn't address any of those issues. So the same poaching groups moved and started hunting both the mountain gorilla and the white rhino more than they had been, both of which were more endangered. And I got to see this because I wasn't just looking at one issue. I was working with enough groups that I got to see that those were connected. And so the tremendously hard and well-motivated work solved one problem, but actually moved the underlying problem space to show up in areas that were even more sensitive. And that was really devastating because the only kind of hope that I had to deal with the devastation of the nature of the problems was that something could be done about it. And so fortunately, I was also studying not just all the different areas of science that I could, but system science and Bucky Fuller's work and Capper's work, and kind of how do all the things fit together. And so I started looking at activism from that lens and saying, how can we understand the nature of the problems well enough that we can come up with solutions that solve that problem, but also don't externalize harm elsewhere? And that required starting to get into economics and the nature of why does perverse incentive arise, and what would it take to internalize perverse incentive and externality, and the nature of governance systems and culture, and basically civilization writ large. And so then that led to saying, okay, well, there's a lot of things that we can say are getting better. You can listen to Hans Rosling or Steven Pinker and pick things that are getting better. But you can also look at most environmentalists or people studying existential risk and look at things getting worse, and both are the case. There are some metrics getting better, there are some getting worse. That's a destabilization of the overall space, but the things that are getting worse are leading to catastrophic tipping points that will break the substrate that allows the things that are getting better to matter. Mm-hmm. So I started forecasting how long do we have on the various things, and started reading Limits of Growth by Club of Rome and all of the different kind of forecasts, as well as studying civilizational collapse theory, Tainter and Baudrillard and things like that. because it becomes pretty clear when you study history that all of the great empires that lived for hundreds or thousands of years don't still exist. Whether it's
I'm curious, how old are you when you're diving into this inquiry? It's just so fascinated that you're so interested and have the dedication to dive into this. When does this occur in your life?
I mean, this is kind of the thread of my whole life, just progressively deeper insight into the process. You know, if you spend time talking with kids where you listen and then actually give them space for the questions to emerge, the dedication is there. Like I do nature walks with kids, and they want to ask around about how do trees suck up water, and how does the light thing work, and how do all the animals and everything interact, and very deep questions. They want to know why the sky is blue, which actually requires understanding things about optics and about astronomy and about the sun, about astrophysics, and as well as like the nature of consciousness. What is the subjective experience of blue? And school just doesn't do a great job of actually facilitating that curiosity. And so if we force people to be interested in shit they aren't interested in and don't facilitate their interest in the things they're actually interested in, we kind of break their interest, and then they want to use some hypernormal stimuli. So I was just fortunate that the things that were interesting to me, I got to pay attention to. And I think anyone that gets to continue to pay attention to the things they're interested in learns, but they also double down on their own interest. So the things I'm describing now were a lot of my kind of teenage focus. And so I started looking at, forecasting and civilizational collapse models, anything from environmental collapse, from overfishing and, peak resource utilization, to pollution issues, to, climate type issues, as well as what are the things that lead to large scale war and infrastructure collapse and those types of things. And that led to recognizing that as our technology exponentiates and the power of our choices exponentiate, but our quality of choice making is not getting commensurately better to the power of our choice making, we're having more and more different escalation pathways to catastrophic risk globally, and higher probability of them, where if we try to think about like biotech risks or nanotech risks or AI mediated risk or large scale war or grid collapse, if we tried to solve any of them on their own, they're almost all impossible to solve, and there's too many of them. So I started thinking about what is driving all of them. Why are humans coordinating at scale in a way that uses our technological power in ways that either directly through conflict theory cause problems, war, and exploitation that is known, or through mistake theory cause problems, unintended externalities. And a lot of it is that, right? Like, I don't think the people when they were making Facebook knew that it would destroy the entire information ecology, but it did. So that's the kind of information theoretic issue. So we started thinking about, is there some set of underlying dynamics that give rise to how humans are coordinating that are what gives rise to all these problems, the generator functions of them? And to just start to think about like perverse incentive. As long as military industrial complex is one of the largest blocks of the global economy, and war is profitable, and you have the capacity for the supply side to manufacture artificial demand, can you have a for-profit military-industrial complex that the entire global economy depends upon and lasting peace in a supply and demand equation? Well, no. So we have to deal with perverse incentive there. That's one example, and we can see it in healthcare, and we can see it in mining, and we can see it everywhere. And so you start looking at, is the nature of the incentive system, the economic system where $50 to $100 trillion a day of human activity moves, but is either directly causing harm or indirectly causing externality, could we shift that in a way where that incentive system, what was in the incentive of an individual or a corporation or a nation was in the aligned with the well-being of the whole better, right? So these were the questions I was asking, and trying to study the Austrian school and straight kind of laissez-faire approaches, or socialist approaches, or Marxist approaches, or like techno-optimist, automate everything approaches. And I got to see that there were strengths and weaknesses of a lot of them, and none of them were actually adequate to the space. So put together some research groups that were working on understanding the space, the generator functions of catastrophic risk well enough to say, is there a categorical set of solutions to the underlying dynamics of how humanity coordinates effectively that is the kernel of a new civilization model? And that when we study civilizational decay of what made Rome fall, and Egypt and the Aztecs and the Mayans and et cetera, that if we understand the dynamics that give rise to civilizational collapse, can we have something that really addresses all of those dynamics and addresses all of the escalation pathways to the catastrophic risks we can see? So
it sounds like, almost, correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe a simple way to put that is, if you were to redesign civilization from scratch, how would you do it? Is that it's almost the frame of like, well, everything that we've done has these strengths and weaknesses. What would we do if we do it again from scratch? Is that kind of where you're coming from here?
Well, this is a valuable question, and it's an insufficient question. And I spent a lot of time when I was young asking it without recognizing the enactment problem. Okay, so we actually get there in factoring that seems that all the people are conditioned currently who are in power in a way that would resist that, and it seems to be not in the immediate best interest of the game theoretic environment. So yes, it's an important thought experiment. If we were going to redesign civilization from scratch, how do we think the best run planet would run? Most enlightened planet would be. Then we have to say, in the current scenario, what is actually a viable path there? And to some degree, you reverse engineer from the idea of a future state. To some degree, you forward engineer how can we be vectoring in the right direction and increasing our capacity to continue to vector in the right direction.
So what I'm hearing is great thought experiment.
Hey, Google, lights on.
That's not... Eugene, do you mind muting yourself? Although that's a great thought experiment, change doesn't start. We can't just hit a button and then redesign. You're saying, cool, great thought experience to have that vision, to think about what is that beautiful thing. And change is evolution. Change is it's messy, right? To actually get to that vision, we actually have to start with where we are.
Yeah.
So where are we, and where do you see us actually being able to go from where we are?
So I'll try to bridge this to some of what Wade was talking about. He was talking about the unraveling of the American empire. I think we can look at, and I don't claim to be representing his views accurately here, but just kind of piggyback on some of the thoughts. We can look at the United States system and say, is it undergoing civilizational decay in the way that led to the breakdown of previous civilizations? And what would the signs of that be? What kind of things can we look for? We can also look at the global system that the world has actually run on since World War II that has been US based, and it's very important to look at these together. From the US perspective, we can, one just kind of quick insightful thing is that throughout history, democracies or republics, systems of participatory governance that were at scale, not like small at tribal scales, never made it to 300 years, right? They have a fairly short life cycle. All empires died, but some of the dynastic ones made it 1,000 years, and the ones that were more participatory governance systems lasted less long. The US is at around 250 years, depending upon exactly the start date you pick. So this is the time cycle factoring history of the adequate decay of a republic. And to understand why, there's a bunch of reasons why, and I won't get into all of them, but the people who are willing to fight a revolutionary war to make something happen, right? If they lived in the direct experience of tyranny of government, and where they were willing to die rather than let themselves be governed in a way that felt tyrannical, then they're also willing to do the extraordinarily hard work of participatory governance, which means show up at the town hall, not just let somebody else make the decisions, read all the papers, be actively informed about what's going on so that you can participate in governance, because you have the direct experience of how terrible not being involved in your own governance is. But as time goes on and several generations pass, and that just becomes a myth that no one has any embodied experience of, and there's like mortgages to pay and stuff on TV and shit to do, I don't even want to go to jury duty, let alone be really actively informed and engaged in participatory governance. So if the people stop checking the state and it's no longer truly a governance of, for, and by the people, then the state stops being able to do what it's supposed to do, which is check the predatory aspects of the market. I'll just make this frame because that's an important frame.
Absolutely, I love it.
One way of thinking about all of the problems in the world is that they're all coordination problems. That it's patterns of human behavior at scale that cause them, and it needs to be different patterns of human behavior at scale to solve them. And so how do we get lots of people to coordinate their behavior when they want different things and they have different understandings of the world and different worldviews in ways that lead to better solutions for the individual groups and the whole overall? It's a hard thing. When the Churchill said about democracy, and the founding fathers here said something similar, that democracy is the single worst form of government ever created, save for all the other forms. What they meant is the idea of governance, that you get a lot of different people to actually participate together, is just a really hard proposition. And it's why, if you look at human history, until like the thing we call civilization only started 10, 13,000 years ago. But we have 200 or 300,000 years of sapient existence of people that were genetically and neurologically similar to us. And those groups never got beyond, give or take, what's called the Dunbar number, 150 people in a tribe. And it's like, why was that such a hard upper bound? Why did, for hundreds of thousands of years, humans never make groups bigger than that? And it's actually like, the simplest way I think of it is it had to do with limits of coordination. Limits of communication and coordination. If the tribe has to make a decision that's very consequential, to move or not, or to change some deep aspect of how they do things, up to about that size, everyone can participate in a tribal council and all have a say in what the rest of their life is going to be subject to. But as soon as you start getting more people than that, everyone can't actually have a say, because you can't have time to listen to 1,000 people, right? It would take a month to make a decision on anything, and no one would even have the work memory to hold it. And so then I have to pick representatives to make choices on my behalf. Now my life is subject to choices that I don't have a say in. No, I'd rather cleave and make my own smaller group and be more self-determined. And so the Dunbar number was a limit of how, and up to that size, I could talk to everyone and get their sentiment on things. So I didn't just have like anonymous, the right or the left over there, that I could just have a pejorative straw man version of. I had people that I knew intimately. So that's almost all of evolutionary history. Now, when the tribe would get as big as it could get, then it would cleave, and some of the people would move somewhere else. Lots of migration happened, till eventually population keeps growing. We've migrated everywhere that we can. Now population keeps growing and tribal warfare becomes pressed, right? Because now we're competing for scarce resource. Now there's a basis to have tribes unify against larger external tribes, and we call that kind of the beginning of civilization, which means it was in a war, game theoretic kind of context. And so now we unify together and try to create government structures for these larger numbers of people because we have to. And so there's binding energy to hold the cleaving energy associated with an enemy hypothesis. Can
I jump in?
Sure.
So when I think of coordination, it feels like it's so related to connection. And if you want to take it further, maybe empathy. Right? When people don't have a sense of each other, or where they're at, or what the pain and problem is, people don't really care. Like, if I really care about something, Daniel, and you might be like, oh, you should meet this person, and that could change my life. Right? You might give me 10 minutes, you might give me an hour, you might help, but it feels like that coordination starts with some sort of connection. That came up for me, so I wonder.
It's a nice.
What you feel.
There definitely needs to be some fealty, And it's a nice idea that it emerges from empathy. It doesn't have to emerge from empathy. It can emerge from a shared enemy, which it often does. And so then there's fealty to each other, not because we necessarily care about each other, but because we care about ourselves and our sub-in-group, and we feel that we have to be bound with them against whoever the out-group is. But yeah, the Dunbar number was partly a limit on how many relationships I could deeply track. And I'm willing to make certain sacrifices of what I want most for people I really know and love and I've known forever and I see every day and they know me. It's much harder to make sacrifices for anonymous people that I have no idea who they are, that are somewhere else, right? And so as you get beyond that, you have to have a shared religion or patriotism or some kind of group identity that everyone gets to be part of, so that they identify with each other through shared group identity, right? We can see that in the US that is broke down, where there's very little sense of what it means to be a US citizen that everyone's on the same page with, that really creates binding energy. There's much more of a sense of what it means to be on the left or the right that has so much enmity towards each other that the thing as a whole doesn't have something like shared nationalism or patriotism, and that's part of the issue.
Sure, I guess, so fundamentally, do humans just need Cain or an enemy to really come together and coordinate in a larger way at scale?
It's a good question, and I think I'll better be able to answer it if we go back to the train was on about coordination.
Go for it.
So if we look at all of the issues we want to solve as coordination issues, because we say, well, no, climate change is not a coordination issue, it's a straightforward environmental issue. We've got to do certain things with the transportation and the energy sector and whatever. No, it's a coordination issue, because you have to have enough people that have a shared worldview around what is true, what is real, what the problem is, that they can come up with adequate solutions, and that a major chunk of humanity isn't fighting against them to keep it from happening because they have a different worldview or different assessment, right? And let's say that your solution involves whatever, some kind of carbon tax or something that countries have to agree to. And agreement without enforcement ends up being a very tricky thing. And how do you do enforcement internationally with superpowers that have nukes? So let's say that the US and Europe were to agree to some kind of taxation policy which decreased their near-term GDP growth, but was good for the environment long-term, and we'd all say, well, that makes sense. But then let's say China doesn't, and we have a concern about China seeking to be a global dominant empire, and if we can't enforce them to, because what enforcement mechanisms are we going to use that don't create war? Then does that just basically, and that increased GDP ends up that they have relative to everyone else equals increased globalization and military powers? Are we just ceding the control of the world to China? Like, that's a very real set of theory of trade-off considerations. So your assessment of climate change can't be separate from your assessment of geopolitics and underlying economics. And so we don't assess the problems in a deep enough, interconnected enough way to come up with good solutions. And we don't have enough shared sense making that enough of the world wants to do the same things, right? So we can say,
what do you mean by sense making? What's that mean?
What is actually real? Is climate change at all, right? So if you talk to some environmentalists, like very good ones like Lovelock, it's not only real, but it's already too late. There's nothing we can do about it, and the Earth will become uninhabitable. Other people say it's a very serious thing. It's on its way to that, but we still have time. There are other people that think that it's a real thing, but it's not that serious. The Earth changes, we'll migrate. And there are other people that think it's an utter hoax, right? Sense making. Have we been able to make sense of the world that we live in well enough to inform what we think are right choices? So when we think about democracy, what we're talking about is a collective choice-making system. How do we not just make choice, me as an individual in my family or an individual economic actor choosing to buy or sell something, but we're going to share roads, we're going to share defense, we're going to decide that it does make sense to start that war or not. So in autocracy, we just basically, the power is ceded to whoever it is that's going to make that choice. But in a participatory governance, we're supposed to participate to do collective choice making. The basis of choice making, collective choice making, is collective sense making about what we think is actually happening. and sense making about what we think the effect of a particular injunction might be, and meaning making. What do we think is important that we're in service to? And communication, our ability to converse effectively enough with each other that we can get on the same page about this so that we can do collective choice making. So choice making has as its antecedents sense making, as its prerequisite, sense making, meaning making, and communication.
And just to jump into sense making, you're reminding me of thinking of an ecology, right? And there's usually a keystone species of that you could kind of like point at and be like, for example, in Colombia, the jaguar. The jaguar's health is great. The Amazon's good. If it's not, Amazon's bad, right? It's a very simple way. So if we think of sense making as a term you mentioned earlier, which was beautiful, in information ecology, where you take this information ecology and make sense of it. How is there something as simple as a keystone species where you could just be like, yeah, we're the health of our sense making right now. It's fundamentally on the decline. It's not healthy. Is there something that we can point out that, or many things that we can point out where we're like, guys, our sense making ability is often, and in this model you described, it's almost like reminds me of the story of the princess and the pea, right? She's sleeping on a pea. She's so sensitive that if a pea is under her bed, it affects her, right? And so there's this almost a butterfly effect, a better approach of if this is off, right? How can we show people that this is off or that it's not? I think that should be a helpful place for us to start.
So I appreciate that as I'm sharing things, individual things I'm saying are sparking interest, and you're wanting to go down those avenues. What I also noticed is that about 6 strands open, which would actually be necessary to close to do a good job of this. And I apologize that part of looking at things in a more interconnected way means the chunk size is a little larger. And that's the important thing for people to understand, is that you can't fit a good assessment of anything into a tweet or into a short news bite. So when attention span...
Forgive me, I'm a millennial.
When attention spans go down, you become a worse sense maker for sure, because you have to compress the complexity of reality into something that will fit into the tiny attention. And so actually expanding attention to be able to hold multiple views, multiple epistemologies, all of the relevant things, so that you can then come up with a solution that's actually adequate is requisite. So I have heard is there a butterfly effect to affect sense making? Let me try to close a couple loops that maybe will bring it together. So we want to improve human coordination. We want to improve our sense making, where we all are better at having the capability of doing assessment of what is actually true, base reality. And you can see in the US right now, hydroxychloroquine is a wonder drug. It's an utter farce that actually kills more people if they use it. Masks really help. Masks make it worse. Systemic racism is this most critical issue in the nation. Systemic racism isn't even a thing, and police violence, when statistically corrected, is worse for white people. On and on, right? China is trying to become a globally dominant empire and is very close, or they're not. There's maximally polarized views around just base reality, because these aren't values. These are is something true, right? So clearly we are not doing a good job at collective sense making. So when we say we want to get collective coordination, we want to get our ability for everyone to actually know what is true empirically well, for us to be able to identify what values we're trying to serve and be able to hear the values someone else is trying to serve and say, are there better strategies that can serve these simultaneously? Maybe I care about the environment here. Maybe you care about your kids being able to get good jobs. And there's a particular proposition that's crafted in a way where if it goes through, your kids get good jobs and the environment's fucked. and vice versa. So I have to pretend like I don't care about kids getting good jobs. You have to pretend like you don't care about the environment because the proposition is based on that theory of trade-offs. And I've now collapsed my values into a strategy to achieve them. But if I said, wait, I care about this, you care about that, is there a better proposition we can come up with for what could achieve both of them? So we separate the value from the strategy to achieve it. You can see that it almost seems mind-bogglingly ridiculous that we have a democracy where you vote on a proposition where you weren't involved in crafting what is a good proposition. So some special interest group that has a very narrow interest puts forward a proposition and markets it to a group of people where it's directly beneficial to them. And this is why almost every proposition gets about half the vote yes and half the vote no, which also means that it inherently polarizes the population, which is why democracies die younger. One of the main reasons is it's actually very hard to get lots of people to coordinate. It's very easy to have one person rule or a small number of people rule. And if you're creating a voting system where the people aren't doing good proposition creation first, it is necessarily polarizing, because the thing that you're voting for seems like it's actively trying to harm what is meaningful and sacred to me, and vice versa. So since the beginning of the thing we call civilization, very few total people have lived in democracies or republics. Almost everybody has lived in feudalism or autocracy of some kind. Democracies have emerged just a few times in rare little pockets. And when they've emerged, they have emerged following periods of cultural enlightenments. This is a really key insight. The cultural enlightenment, because this can come to your butterfly effect.
Yeah.
The cultural enlightenment, so the Athenian democracy, with all of its flaws, still a movement in the direction of more participatory governance, emerged out of a kind of Greek Enlightenment that valued everyone's ability to do better sense making. So let's really value education and the development of the individual. So everyone should learn history and formal logic and grammar and rhetoric and etc. So they can all actually make sense of base reality on their own and make good choices. And then they all also need the Socratic method, which means that they can argue any point. They can take other people's perspective well. And you can see how profoundly broken down that capacity and that value and orientation currently is. If you have a bunch of people that can make sense of reality directly on their own, not listen to what some authority said and decide which of the authorities they listen to, but direct empirical capacity, and then they can take each other's perspective, those people can have a conversation that will end up resulting in some ability for effective compromise and movement forward. But if the capacity for sense-making conversation breaks down, then the basis that gave rise to the democracy or republic being able to emerge breaks down. And so we can see that in the US came out of the European Enlightenment, where there was this kind of Renaissance idea of you don't just have to be a specialist at one thing, you can have a deep background in lots of things. Science, we can actually empirically all get a good base understanding of reality, and the Hegelian dialectic will always seek for any thesis an antithesis and then a higher order synthesis. Can we take multiple perspectives and try to find higher order reconciliation? That the underlying public education and fourth estate or news that are required for people to all be developed in their capacity to make sense of the world and participate in governance and to know what's going on have went through enough institutional decay that nobody really has a sense of what's going on, or to the degree they do, they are outraged and certain about things that half the population thinks that they're desperately wrong about, right? That they're outraged and certain about. So we can look at this as the collapse of the American empire, because you don't have the ability for a real republic, because you don't have participatory governments, because the prerequisites aren't there. Mm-hmm. We can also look at it in a bigger way, which is we can, and this will then wrap up, we can look at the breakdown of the first ever globalized world order that has been since World War II. Because of course, empires got larger as time went on, and there was a game theoretic competition for more size. British Empire was not quite a world-ruling empire. But after World War II, it was the first time that we could never have a war again between the major empires. We had always had war between major empires, but they never had a nuke. They never had utterly catastrophic tech that made a war that no one could win. And so after World War II, we had to do something unprecedented and say, how do we never have a war between the major parties again? And so we said, well, we have to be so economically interdependent that it's never advantageous to bomb each other, because it is better to coordinate with each other. And so let's do globalization. and have supply chains that interconnect us in such a way that we don't survive without import and export. Well, in a way that made sense, right? And we had proxy wars, but we didn't have major wars from then till now. But it also created one global civilization, really, because none of the nations really can operate on their own. A global civilization mediated by globalism that is profoundly fragile, where breakdown, a virus in one part of the world can become a virus in the entire world, can start breaking down supply chains, breaking down social fabric within countries, between countries. And so COVID was just a big enough thing to show the systemic fragility. And the systemic fragility that's been cascading is really like the second and third order effects are really just starting to show up and will continue for some time. And obviously, when we look at the social tension that arose with George Floyd, it was a long-term issue. But after a tremendous amount of unemployment, of course, there's going to be more likelihood for violence in the street, because when people's fundamental needs aren't met, you always get more willingness for violence. And so even that was one of the secondary effects of COVID type effects. So what we're experiencing right now also is that the globalized world order, the kind of Bretton Woods agreements put in place, are breaking down, or almost totally broken down. The U.S. has pulled out of NATO, out of WHO, decreased to the UN, and the major empires, the biggest countries in the world, are doing cyber attacks on each other and espionage, and they know it. So it's not following peacetime agreements. It's basically unconventional war rather than conventional kinetic war, but it can switch into conventional kinetic war. So we have a breakdown of the global order, and we have a breakdown of the country that was leading the global order kind of simultaneously. And then we have a very big question of, so what happens next? Do we have increasing chaos and like population reduction, catastrophic risk writ large? Do we have China move into actually increasing their coherent capacity to build trains all around the world and ports and whatever, and they run the world? And what does that look like? Or at the end of where the US has decayed to, can we reboot something like a meaningful participatory governance? If you were to want to reboot it, you have to drive a cultural enlightenment that is the prerequisite. This is the butterfly, is the high value on everyone's capacity to do much better sense making and much higher quality conversation so they can participate.
I think this is the exact conversation I want you and Wade to kind of discuss and digest, and that was beautiful. Thank you. How are you feeling? Do you want to take a breath? How about we all take a breath and then we'll come back with Wade?
Sure.
Okay, great. I think it's almost like you've opened the connection of where both of you really, really fit in together. And I think now the audience gets both of you really well, where you're coming from. And I'm excited